All right, the 31st Nigerian Economic Summit with the theme, the Reform Imperative, Building a Prosperous and Inclusive Nigeria by 2030, is coming at a pivotal moment in Nigeria's development journey. With bold reforms already underway, the summit is convening a diverse gathering of global leaders, senior government officials, CEOs, economists, development partners, scholars, and change makers to build consensus on the next phase of Nigeria's transformation and shape actionable policies and practical solutions for Nigeria's socio-economic development. The summit will seek to adopt a pragmatic, future-facing lens to shape a cohesive national agenda that balances macroeconomic stability with inclusive growth. All right, I have Dr. Tayo Adulojo. He is the CEO, Nigeria Economic Summit Group. He joins us in the studio to speak more on this. Let me just, by the way, I'm glad to have you join us. I was going to run off, but glad to have you join us on Arise News Night. Let me start from the last sentence I read, that the summit will seek to adopt a pragmatic, future-facing lens to shape a cohesive national agenda that balances macroeconomic stability with inclusive growth. Can you break that down for those who are watching to understand what you're really talking about?
Absolutely. You know, when you think of what makes a nation competitive, normally you discuss a set of factors. On the economic side, people discuss growth, economic growth. And most economists want to measure that by the size of your GDP and the growth of your GDP rate. But when we discuss growth in terms of robustness of growth, as we're going to discuss at this summit, we discuss growth with depth. In other words, growth must have diversification. It must have economic expansion of diverse sectors, especially in our case, a diversification from oil-only earnings in terms of export revenues. It must have technology upgrade because we are in the fourth industrial revolution. If you remember, countries like Nigeria did not fully participate in the third, second, and first industrial revolution. And then, of course, it must have human impact. It must solve for building human competitiveness. So when we discuss macroeconomic stability that has that inclusion dynamics, it must have all those pieces in it. Now, to do that, you must then ask what are the drivers of macroeconomic growth and stability that has these dynamics. We've anchored the summit on 5 pillars. Okay. Right. One is if you want to grow,
which you call 5 critical sub-themes.
Yes. You know, the first is, you have to industrialize. You have to be able to sell to the rest of the world more complex products, with economic value added that makes you earn more money. But to do that, you must backward integrate. You cannot be wasting tomato harvests in Katsina. You cannot be sending all your unrefined crude overseas and bringing refined crude into the country. You cannot continue to have 70% post-harvest losses in vegetables. You cannot continue to under-cultivate more than 60-70% of your arable land. That's not productivity.
And then there is the question of insecurity.
Absolutely. So industrialization, the industrialization pillar of the summit is anchored on that priority. How do you enable the country to transform its endowments and its assets into national competitive advantages? The second is investment. Now, for a nation to attract investment, you must build an investment climate that allows for big money to come. The president has set a goal of a $1 trillion economy, which means, on the average, you are going to be attracting somewhere between $10 to $15 billion a year on year for the next 5 years. That requires a very attractive environment for doing business. Big money comes the way it's treated well. So for example, when you take something like the size of the Dangote refinery, a $20 billion investment, right? How we treat that refinery and the investor determines whether other investors will come. So investment climate is important. That's a big part of what we're going to discuss at the summit. How do you build the right regulatory environment, the right investor protection, investment aftercare, the right regulatory forward guidance that allows other investors looking to say, rather than put my 1 billion in Angola or in Ethiopia, I will put it in Nigeria. So
have confidence.
Have confidence. I know, and this, so investment, the investment pillar has two sides. What you do to domestic investors, okay?
Because they're important too.
Oh, actually, the principle is international investors first look at how domestic investors are treated.
Yeah. Charity begins at home.
Absolutely. And then they think to themselves, well, if you're going to do that
to your own, what will you do to me?
Absolutely.
Coming from out?
And that can be a challenge. And then, of course, the other part of investments is that investments go into assets, right? It's assets that drive productivity and growth. Most of Nigeria's assets are trapped in regulatory, political, vested interest dynamics that has not allowed them to perform. So we take large sums of money, we put it in an asset, but the asset can't pay for itself. Whether it's rail, airports, refineries, I mean, we've been investing in our refineries for X number of years. And you ask the question, where is the return on the investment?
Yeah.
Okay? Those are big issues. And by the way, every time there's a true economic transformation, national assets rise to higher levels of productivity. Okay, so that's pillar 3. Pillar 4 is then you must have the institutions to do the hard work, right? Regulators in an environment that is transformative solve for building markets, right? For developing markets, for creating the capacity for the markets to scale. And remember that regulators regulate entities that are competing in the market space. The more efficient the regulator in doing that work, the more transformative it becomes. The fourth is
the
inclusion.
Fifth, you mean?
Yeah, so the fifth.
Okay, because you have answered my question. How do you intend to advance inclusion for shared growth, especially in this era?
Absolutely.
I think you're dealing with the fifth.
Yeah, so on inclusion, you then have to do this by carrying people along. You know, you then have to do it by ensuring that your growth creates jobs, your growth lifts people out of poverty, solves for inequality.
Somebody says if you want to run fast, run alone.
Yeah.
If you want to run far, take people along.
So let me give you a great example. When we had an oil boom, Nigeria's economy was driven by double-digit growth, massive expansion in GDP, but it was jobless growth in the first decade of this millennium, right? So you can grow and have jobless growth. Wow. Especially when all the capabilities don't sit in your country. So one of the advantages of investments that come here to build capabilities, and you know, if you take, by the way, we've invited Alhaji Aliko Dangote to keynote tomorrow. We hope he can make it.
And you said you invited Indonesians to come.
So we've actually invited all middle power nations to come, right? So the MICTA nation, Mexico,
let them tell us
Indonesia. So this story of growing apart. Yeah. One of the lessons from middle power nations is you protect your investors, you allow them to win, because national competitive advantage, it comes from your firms. Countries don't compete globally. It is businesses that compete globally. The more Nigerian businesses, it's your Dangotes, your Innoson, that will compete around the world. If you kill them at home and they cannot compete, you lose, right? So the secret of competitiveness is that your country must confer on a set of institutions, businesses, and your own local conglomerates the right to win. So we discussed ACFTA. So trade is a big part of the conversation we're going to have at the summit. But you can't compete in trade if your local firms do not have competitive advantage. It is policy and reforms
that would drive
that confer on businesses the right to compete. So let me give you 4 examples quickly from NESG's history.
Do I have that time?
Okay, let me give you one. So think of telecommunications. Telecommunication, we had a Nitel asset stock in yesterday. And policy and reforms created a space for the country to move its bandwidth to companies that it conferred the right to compete. Today, the story is different, right? We went from almost 500,000 fixed lines to almost less than 0.1% teledensity to almost 100% teledensity. We did it in 2 decades. It's called the GSM revolution. In that process, what mattered the most was creating an environment where the investor can win, expanding the opportunities, taking the gridlock away, and allowing the regulator to drive the direction of growth, right? So if you remember, that market created losers.
Of course, with regulations.
Yeah, no.
And making sure that you don't have a monopoly in
So
place.
a good example was that, if you remember, the GSM revolution created the dominance of some players. And they were losers. Intercellular, Multilink, Starcoms. The regulator, knowing that the market it had created had losers, smoothened it by creating a unified license process that allowed the winners buy off the losers in the way they won.
I wish you had all the time. In fact, what you said that caught my attention was how you can grow and not have jobs in your country. But I don't have time to discuss. I wish I had time to.
So jobless growth means you're exporting
that.
jobs, right? And that happens when you're not building any local capacity.
All right, we need to go.
Thanks.
Dr. Tayo Adulojo is the CEO, Nigeria Economic Summit Group. Thank you for the interesting discussion.
Thank you so much.